This occurred to me a few years back after I had just rented and settled into a new home. The first week flew by without any problems. I unpacked, purchased some new furniture, and arranged everything as I liked. The main reason I chose this place was because I had a remote job, so having a quiet area to work was essential. The house was isolated from others, providing me with a calm workspace. One morning, after preparing breakfast and sitting down to start my work, I heard a knock at the front door. I walked over to answer it, and it was my landlord. He was grinning and asked how I was doing. "I'm doing well, thank you," I replied, still puzzled about his visit. He tried to engage in some small talk for a moment before mentioning he was just checking in on me, and then he left. I returned to my work, but the encounter felt odd. I didn't mind his friendliness, but he could have just texted me instead of dropping by unexpectedly. The rest of the day passed, and I forgot about it. After dinner, I decided to take a walk around my street. The homes in the neighborhood were spaced out, so I hadn't really seen many of them yet. I strolled for about 30 minutes and then turned back. As I rounded the corner toward my house, I noticed a vehicle parked on the side of the road. It wasn't directly in front of my house, but there weren't any other houses close by. When I walked past it, I recognized it as the same car my landlord had parked in his driveway when he showed me the place. Yet there was no one inside. I quickly made my way up the driveway and entered the house. I peered out the windows, trying to see if he was in the yard, but there was no sign of him. I felt uncomfortable and uneasy about the situation. I had just walked through the entire neighborhood, so I couldn't imagine where else he could be other than at the house. After a while, I stopped looking because I wasn't seeing anything. Another hour passed before I heard a knock on the front door. Checking through the peephole, I saw it was my landlord again. I sighed in annoyance and opened the door. He was smiling again and asked how I was doing. "Yeah, I'm still good, thanks. Can you please let me know next time you plan to drop by?" I said politely, trying to avoid being rude. He apologized, stating he just wanted to ensure I was satisfied with the place. I smiled and said I needed to return to work before closing the door. Something about that interaction, the way he spoke and the look in his eyes, felt really unsettling. It was clear that he didn't grasp social cues, but he still made me feel uneasy. That night, I lay in bed contemplating the best way to tell him I wanted to be left alone. He was my landlord, and this was technically his property, but there were rules in place for rental agreements. I eventually fell asleep, still uncertain about what to do. I was awakened not long after. It was well past midnight when a knock at my door jolted me awake. I turned on the lights and headed downstairs, thinking that if it was the landlord again, I would be furious. I checked the peephole, and sure enough, it was him once more. I swung the door open. "What are you doing here? You can't be here right now. You need to go," I said firmly, barely containing my anger. That's when I noticed he was holding a duffel bag. He explained that there was an urgent repair needed for the pipes in the basement, claiming an alarm on his phone went off indicating a minor gas leak. However, none of the alarms in the house had gone off, which struck me as suspicious. I told him I'd just call someone in the morning and started to close the door when he suddenly pushed his way inside, feigning ignorance about my attempt to close it. I stood there, unsure of how to react. He looked at me from inside my home and smiled. "It'll only take a minute," he said. He set down the duffel bag and requested that I follow him to see the issue with the pipe. He opened the basement door and started down the stairs, and I hesitantly followed. A few steps down, I had a thought. "Hold on, I'm gonna grab my phone to take pictures. I'll be right back," I said, quickly hurrying back up the steps. Thankfully, he remained behind. I rushed to my room to grab my phone and keys, then went toward the front door. Before leaving, I glanced at the duffel bag and opened it to check its contents, just to be sure. Inside, there weren't any tools, at least none that looked familiar. I didn't recognize what they were, and I didn't have time to investigate further. Hearing him come back up the stairs, I hurried out of the house and into my car, driving away. I called the police as I parked in a nearby lot. What happened next still haunts me every day. My landlord was still at the house when the police arrived, but the duffel bag he brought was missing. They never found it. In the end, all that happened was I was allowed to move out without paying a lease termination fee. His strange behavior, his unexpected visits, and his attempt to come inside were not enough for the police to take action. Naturally, I accepted the offer to leave immediately, but in the back of my mind, I knew he was out there, likely doing whatever he planned to do to me to someone else, and there was nothing I could do about it. I lived with my older sister for about 4 years after graduating school. We shared the rent on a small apartment, as neither of us could afford a place on our own. During the 4th year, however, my sister got a better paying job and planned to move out once our lease was up. I, on the other hand, wasn't making much money, so I knew I wouldn't be able to cover the rent alone. For a few months, I searched online for a potential roommate, but eventually decided it would be best to look for a cheaper place altogether. I kept up the search until the final month of our lease, by which time my sister had moved out most of her things, leaving me to find a new place under time pressure. It wasn't easy with my limited budget, but eventually, I came across a listing from someone renting a room in their house. The person's name was Ben. I texted Ben to show my interest, though I kept looking around. A few minutes later, he messaged back, and we set up a call for later that day. When we spoke, he explained that he lived alone and was offering his spare room for rent. He added that I'd be welcome to use the rest of the house as well, which sounded perfect. I agreed, and a few weeks later, I packed up a U-Haul and drove to the house. Over the next few weeks, we'd kept in contact by text and calls, and he'd sent several pictures of the place, though I hadn't seen it in person yet. I arrived around midday and parked in the driveway. The house was small but looked nice from the outside. Ben waved me over from the garage, gave me a quick tour, and helped unload my things into my room. Ben seemed like an ordinary guy in his early 30s, about 10 years older than me. He wasn't the best at small talk, but that didn't bother me much. Once we finished moving everything, I returned the U-Haul and grabbed an Uber back to the house. By then, it was nearly 8 p.m. and I was exhausted. Ben was on the couch watching TV, so I told him I'd be heading to bed early. The place seemed decent and I felt pretty content with it. After unpacking a bit more and setting up my bed, I was finally ready to sleep around 9. As I went to close the door, though, I noticed there was no lock on the inside. Puzzled, I opened the door and realized that the lock was on the outside. I walked into the living room and asked Ben why the door locked from the outside. He looked puzzled and said he'd never noticed, but would switch it around the next day. I shrugged it off, feeling too tired to worry much about it, and returned to my room. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen. Figuring it was Ben getting a late-night snack, I started to drift back to sleep. A moment later, I heard him walk down the hall, stopping outside my door. I opened my eyes, staring at the door, and then heard a click. He'd locked me in. My stomach sank as a chill spread over me. When I heard him walk back to his room and close the door, I quietly got up and tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. I stood there, stunned, realizing this person I just met had locked me in the room. At that point, fear turned to anger. I called out for Ben, demanding he open the door. He quickly rushed over, but I could hear him hesitate for a moment before unlocking it. I swung open the door and asked him what he was doing. Ben mumbled something about wanting to feel secure since he didn't know me well yet. I understood the concern, but told him locking someone in a room wasn't the right approach. I decided to pack up and leave the next morning, staying up all night on the couch. Around 9, I noticed his bedroom door was closed and hoped he was asleep. I drove to pick up another U-Haul, but when I returned, his door was open. I called his name, but there was no answer. Peeking in, I saw his room was empty. Disturbed, I immediately started packing up my things. I spent a couple of hours moving boxes and disassembling my bed. Almost done except for a couple of boxes. As I was carrying one out, Ben suddenly appeared in the doorway. I told him to move, and after a moment's pause, he stepped aside. I hurried to load the box and returned for the last one. A half-full box of food from my old pantry, which I'd almost left behind. Ben handed it to me, and as I put it in the truck, I noticed him reaching for the U-Haul door, trying to pull it down. I managed to push him away before he could close it. He fell back, got up quickly, and ran. Not into the house, but toward the trees nearby. Not wanting to stick around to find out more, I shut the door and drove away. My sister let me stay with her while I looked for a new place. I still don't know what was going on in that house, but it was definitely something unsettling. After relocating to a freshly built home in a different part of the state, I was eager for a fresh start. My prior landlord decided to sell his property, and when my lease expired, I had to find a new place. I opted to lease this new home and was genuinely excited to settle in. But right from the start, I noticed a man across the street. A man who often seemed to stare at me from his window. He appeared to be in his 40s, and it was odd how he seemed to rarely leave his house. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking he might simply be curious about the new neighbor. But as the days went by, I sensed something wasn't quite right. He never interacted with anyone, rarely smiled, and, unsettlingly, never seemed to leave his property. Instead, he stayed around, keeping an eye on me from across the street. I occasionally caught sight of him late at night, standing in his yard, his gaze fixed in my direction, and it started to make me uneasy. One evening, as I was winding down to sleep, I heard an odd scraping noise outside, as if someone was dragging something heavy across the ground. Peeking through the blinds, I saw my neighbor hauling a large ladder across his lawn. Given how late it was, I found it strange that he'd be doing any housework at that hour. I tried to convince myself that I was just nervous, adjusting to new surroundings and unfamiliar faces. But despite my attempts to relax, an uneasy feeling about my neighbor lingered. The next morning, things took an unnerving turn. I spotted him standing at the end of my driveway, staring at me through my living room window. Quickly, I shut the curtains, doing my best to ignore him, though his presence left me with a chill. I hated that he had been so close to my house, so I hurried to my car and left for work. As I drove away, I noticed him back on his property, still watching me. The situation only got worse. One night, while in bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in my backyard, which was securely fenced. I peered out the window, but the footsteps went silent. I lay in bed, alert, for nearly half an hour before daring to look out again. There, at the far end of my yard, stood a figure, shadowed in the darkness, staring right at me. Alarmed, I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the person had disappeared. I mentioned my neighbor's suspicious behavior, but with no evidence of actual wrongdoing, they couldn't do much. I realized then that unless something more severe happened, I'd be handling this on my own. From that point on, I took extra steps to secure my home, locking all doors and windows, and tried to limit my time outside. Despite these efforts, I couldn't shake the discomfort I felt. 2 weeks had passed since I'd moved in, and I was already considering breaking my lease. Then one night, I came home late, went straight to bed, and was abruptly awakened by a loud thud against the side of my house. The sound came from right outside my second-floor bedroom wall. My heart pounding, I cautiously peeked out the window. To my horror, my neighbor's face was just inches from mine, staring right at me through the glass. He was standing on a ladder, trying to peer into my room. Panicking, I jumped back and screamed as he quickly climbed down and ran off. I called the police again, and they arrived in minutes, catching him in the act of taking down the ladder. Although he didn't confess to anything, his actions were clear. Days later, another neighbor came by and told me they'd had unsettling encounters with the same man. They'd once seen him peering into their window when they came home from work. Part of me wondered if this entire situation could have been avoided had they reported him sooner. Regardless, I was relieved that it was over. A few years back, I booked a place on Airbnb, a simple getaway, mostly just to relax and unwind. It was a cabin around 5 hours from where I lived. The cabin was tucked away, with only a handful of other cabins scattered within a mile, surrounded by a dense forest right behind it. It was exactly what I wanted, and when I arrived in the early morning, I was thrilled. I spent some time exploring the property and testing out some of its unique features. Later in the afternoon, I sat on the back porch in a swinging chair, soaking in the scenery. Then, out of the blue, I noticed a man walking in the woods. He seemed like any other person, so I assumed he might be staying at one of the nearby cabins. I watched him as he continued walking deeper into the trees until he disappeared from view, and I went back to enjoying the peaceful surroundings. I think I stayed outside for about an hour before heading back inside, making myself some dinner and settling in to watch a movie that night. At some point during the movie, the doorbell rang. I hadn't even realized the cabin had a doorbell. Still, I went to answer it. Standing on the porch was the man I'd seen in the woods. He flashed a big smile and told me he'd been lost for a while and needed help finding his cabin. I hesitated, sensing something unusual about him, though I couldn't pinpoint why. "Sure, let me grab my phone so you can look up the directions," I replied. I shut the door and walked back to the couch to grab my phone, but when I returned to open the door, he was gone. I scanned the porch and yard but didn't see him anywhere. Puzzled, I shut the door and went back to the couch, feeling a little uneasy but deciding to brush it off. I eventually relaxed and went to bed, surprisingly managing to get a decent night's sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee to enjoy the fresh air. About 10 minutes later, I spotted that same man again, walking along the exact path in the woods as the day before. It struck me as odd because now I knew for sure he wasn't actually lost. So why had he come to my door? I felt uneasy and went back inside to call a friend, sharing the weird situation to get a second opinion. Talking it over helped until I heard a sound that sent chills down my spine. The doorbell. I whispered to my friend what was happening and kept them on the call as I opened the door. "Can I help you?" I asked cautiously. The man gave me the same big smile and repeated his request, claiming he was lost and needed directions. This time, I looked at him with clear confusion and irritation. Then he asked again, "Could you get your phone and look up the directions?" A shiver went down my spine. I shut the door immediately and filled my friend in on what just happened. They urged me to leave as fast as I could. I agreed and started packing my things in a hurry. Before heading to my car, I peered through the peephole to make sure he was gone. Seeing the coast was clear, I rushed out, threw my bags in the car, and started backing out of the driveway. As I pulled away, I caught sight of him standing in the cabin's front window, watching me leave. When I got home, I reached out to the Airbnb host to report the encounter with this unsettling man. The host's response was oddly brief and dismissive, simply apologizing for any discomfort during my stay. Even now, I have no idea what that man's intentions were, but the image of him staring out from inside the cabin just seconds after I'd left remains one of the most haunting memories I've ever had. I'm 31, living close to the Blue Ridge area in southern West Virginia. I've been hiking and camping through mountain trails here for years. My closest friend, who lives nearby, often comes along on these trips. Each autumn, we'd map out a big route, sometimes lasting several days or even a full week of camping. In 2021, we set plans for a route up to a lake hidden deep in the mountains. Just days before, though, my friend had to cancel because of an urgent issue at work. I had already booked my time off and gathered my gear, so I decided to go on my own. Early Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead and started the journey. This wasn't a well-worn path you'd find on a day hike. These trails lack clear markers, so navigation relies on maps, a compass, and spotting large landmarks in the distance, like a distinct rock formation, to guide your way. Over 2 days, I trekked toward a ridge in the mountains. As the second day came to an end, I set up camp a few hours away from the ridge. I pitched my tent, built a fire, and heated some food I'd packed. The sun had set, and around 8, I lay down in my tent to rest and read, leaving the fire burning to put out before fully falling asleep. Maybe 20 minutes in, I heard a loud snap, like a stick breaking just behind my tent. I sat up quickly, thinking it might be a bear sniffing around, drawn by the scent of food. After a moment of silence, I crawled out of the tent and shone a flashlight toward the trees. Nothing. I called out loudly, hoping to scare off any animals, but there was no noise in return. The snap had been too sharp to imagine. Something had definitely stepped on it. After looking around for a while, I put out the fire and went back inside the tent. Falling asleep wasn't easy that night. I was too focused on any possible sounds. By morning, I was surprised I'd actually managed to sleep. I packed up and continued toward the ridge, which led straight to the lake. I tried to hike quickly to reach it before dark so I wouldn't need to set up camp again. I got there just before sunset, and the lake was stunning, worth every step. After setting up my camp by the tree line, I sat by the fire, though I kept glancing back, hearing soft sounds somewhere in the trees. They sounded like faint footsteps, but I convinced myself it was nothing. The thought that someone else might be nearby was unsettling. Since it was dark, I couldn't see much beyond the firelight. Later, I lay down in the tent, hearing faint steps every so often. They were quiet enough that I wasn't sure what they were. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. But maybe an hour later, I woke suddenly to the sound of footsteps running away from my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and darted outside, aiming it in the direction of the noise. In the distance, I saw someone retreating into the dark. My heart raced as I looked down, seeing footprints around my tent like they had been pacing around. I quickly restarted the fire, feeling vulnerable and afraid. With no help nearby, I sat by the fire until dawn, keeping watch. In the morning, I took some photos of the lake and began the trek back, cutting the trip short. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I noticed small things missing from my bag, some food, a couple of tools. I kept my backpack with me, so even now, the idea that someone might have come into my camp and taken things while I was sleeping chills me to the core. I'm a 30-year-old woman, and this took place when I was 28, back in 2021. My friend, who I'll call Lisa, told me about another friend, Megan, who was looking for a dog sitter. Megan and her partner were planning a trip to Florida and needed someone to watch their dog. Lisa knew I was a sitter on an app called Wag, where you can stay at people's homes, walk their dogs, and more. Since I could use some extra cash, the offer of $200 to watch the dog for 5 days seemed perfect. Megan gave me a quick tour of her house a week before her trip and introduced me to her big husky, Moose. He was a little chubby but super sweet. Megan told me I could help myself to any food in the house, and she showed me the keypad lock on the front door, which made me feel safe since it was secure. When the week came around, I arrived late Friday evening after Megan and her husband had left for their trip. Things were pretty relaxed for the first couple of days. I was working most of the afternoons and came by to feed Moose during my lunch break. I'd go back in the evening, take him for rides, stay up late watching TV, and let him sleep near me when I went to bed. On Monday night after work, I heard a knock at the door. When I looked through the peephole, there was a man wearing what looked like a dark security uniform. I thought it was odd, but I opened the door a little to ask if something was wrong. "Hey, I'm looking for a mark," he said. Confused, I replied, "There's no mark here. I'm just watching the dog for a friend. I've been here since Friday." Thinking back, I realized it wasn't smart to tell a stranger I was alone, but he just nodded and asked, "How long will you be here?" "Till Thursday," I answered, and he said, "All right, no problem," and left. I thought it was strange but locked the door and texted Megan to tell her about it. She just shrugged it off, saying not to worry, so I tried to do the same. Things were normal until Wednesday night, close to midnight. As I was lying in bed, I had this nagging feeling to double-check the front door, so I got up to see if it was locked. Luckily, it was, but I still felt uneasy. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to Moose barking loudly. I was a bit scared, thinking someone might have broken in. I went to the living room, where I saw Moose growling and barking at the front door. Looking through the peephole, I saw the same man, this time with another guy, both dressed in similar security-style uniforms. At this point, I was creeped out. Why would he come back, especially knowing I was alone? I didn't open the door this time. Instead, I watched as they walked away, making sure all the locks were secure. After they'd left, I peeked outside but didn't see any security vehicles around. I honestly believe Moose's barking might have scared them off. I didn't mention this to Megan, as she was out of state anyway, and thankfully I only had one more night to stay there. To this day, I have no clue who those men were or what they wanted, but I haven't agreed to dog sit again since then. I worked the night shift as a receptionist at a small town inn. My main tasks involve checking in guests, answering calls, and watching the security feeds. It's generally a quiet job, as our inn doesn't see a lot of traffic. One particular evening, only a few guests were staying with us, and I was sitting at the front desk when I noticed a man approaching the entrance. I stood to greet him as he walked in. His eyes were red, and he seemed to be under the influence of something. "I need a room for the night," he said in a rough voice. Despite his condition, I checked him in, following our policy of allowing walk-in guests when the inn isn't close to full. After handing him his key, he headed toward the elevator, and I returned to my phone. A few hours later, while at the front desk, I heard a faint thumping noise coming from the hallway. Curious, I walked around to find the man I'd checked in earlier, standing at the end of the hall and tugging at a maintenance door. "Do you need help finding something?" I asked. He turned to look at me with an unsettling stare but didn't reply. Not wanting to escalate the situation, I decided to leave him alone and return to my desk. After that, the inn was silent. No one came in or moved about. Around 3 in the morning, I decided to do a quick walkthrough of the lobby floor, partly to stay alert. As I neared the hallway by the front desk, I heard a loud banging noise coming from one of the rooms upstairs. I stopped, listening for any other sounds, then made my way up to the second floor, where I thought the noise had come from. Everything was eerily quiet. Walking down the hall, I noticed that one of the room doors at the end was slightly open. I knocked gently but got no response. Taking a quick peek inside, I saw that the room was empty. I noted the number 112, the same room I'd given to the man earlier. Oddly, I hadn't seen him leave the building. Returning to the front desk, I checked the security cameras, scanning both the lobby and exterior, but there was no sign of him. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was a guest calling to report someone knocking at her door during the night. I apologized and promised to handle it. After hanging up, I felt a growing sense of unease. Before I could act, the phone rang again. Another guest was reporting the same issue, a man knocking on their door. At this point, I decided to contact the police. I waited by the main entrance, prepared to leave quickly if necessary. The police arrived soon after, and fortunately, nothing happened before they got there. Although they searched the building, they didn't find the man. Instead, they discovered a broken window in his room. Apparently, he had exited that way. The room was on the second floor, so it was surprising he managed to get out without serious injury. Later, the police received information that the car he'd used to pay for his stay was stolen. I don't know what his intentions were or why he went around knocking on people's doors, but I'm grateful none of the guests opened their doors to him. The situation could have ended far worse if they had. Last year, I went on a lengthy 10-day road trip. I wasn't heading to any specific place. I simply drove in a large loop, stopping in around 5 or 6 cities. I hadn't reserved any hotels beforehand since I didn't know how much time I'd want to spend in each place or where I'd decide to take breaks along the way. So, I was counting on hotels that allowed walk-ins. For the first 5 nights, I managed to find decent places to stay along my route. But on the 6th night, I ran into some trouble. I was driving between 2 cities, and around 11 p.m., I felt my eyes getting heavy. I thought about pushing through to the next big city and just sleeping in a parking lot if I had to, but I was way too tired to keep driving safely. I pulled over and called a few well-known hotels along the way, but none were taking walk-ins that late. I started getting anxious, worried I might end up sleeping on the side of the road, which didn't feel safe. Just then, I spotted a sign for a hotel about 10 miles ahead. I drove to it and parked in front. This hotel was small, more like a motel, with a single story and rooms lined up side by side. There were only a few other cars in the lot, so it seemed pretty empty. I got out, went to the reception desk, and asked the woman working if they had any rooms available. Fortunately, they had one left, so she handed me a key card. I grabbed my bag from the car and headed to my room. It looked a bit old-fashioned, but for the price, it was all right. However, just a minute after I entered, there was a knock at the door. I cracked it open to see who was there and saw a man muttering something to himself. As soon as he noticed the door open, he pushed against it, trying to get inside while still mumbling to himself. I quickly blocked the door with my arm, stopping him from forcing his way in. The man stopped talking, looked up at me, and I firmly told him to leave. He eventually turned and walked away. I watched him go before locking the door again. It felt strange, but I didn't feel too threatened, assuming he might just be someone struggling or confused. I tried to shake it off and, about 15 minutes later, finally fell asleep. A couple of hours into the night, I was woken up by another knock. I was instantly annoyed, assuming it was the same man from before. This time, I put the chain lock on before cracking open the door. I'm glad I did, because the second I unlocked it, the man threw his weight against the door, shouting random, nonsensical things. I backed up and immediately called 911. He kept ramming into the door, trying to break it down. At one point, he shoved a knife between the door and tried to cut through the chain. Though the chain held firm, it was terrifying to realize he had a weapon. The yelling, banging, and scraping went on for several minutes before everything suddenly went quiet. The police arrived a short while later, but by then, the man was gone. I had no idea what was wrong with him or why he was so determined to break into my room, but it was clear he had bad intentions. Maybe he was just out of his mind, but having someone attempt to break in with a knife was terrifying. Moments like that make you realize how a small mistake, like answering the wrong knock or leaving the door unlocked, could have serious consequences. I don't think he had any personal grudge against me, but every now and then, I still get that eerie feeling, like someone might be watching. My roommate was away for the week, so I had the whole place to myself. It was spring break, so college classes were on hold too. I didn't have any big plans or anything pressing to do. On Monday, I was pretty much stuck inside because a major storm was tearing through town. This sort of weather was common this time of year, but each time it felt more intense. The trees bent and twisted as if they'd snap, and the house groaned and creaked nonstop. Knowing I'd have trouble sleeping, I decided to stay up. I turned on the gaming console and started one of my favorite games, playing for over an hour, probably until around 11 when the doorbell rang. I paused the game, got up, but then remembered the storm. Who would be outside in weather like this? I went to the front door and looked through the peephole but saw nothing. When I opened the door, wind and rain immediately hit me, but no one was there. I shut the door, thinking maybe the storm somehow triggered the doorbell. I know it sounds silly now, but what else could it have been? I went back to my game, but only a few minutes later, I heard a loud crash from the backyard. I knew right away it had to be the patio furniture, so I rushed to the back door. Sure enough, everything was scattered across the yard, being tossed around by the wind. I quickly slipped on my shoes and headed outside, starting to gather each piece and push it against the house to keep it from blowing away. The wind stung, and the rain was almost painful as it hit my face. I worked as fast as possible until I noticed someone at the far edge of the yard. They were standing there, just watching me. I stared back for a moment, but then grabbed the last piece of furniture and dashed inside to escape the rain. Once inside, I looked back out, but they were gone. Between that and the doorbell, I was feeling uneasy. I sat in the living room, scrolling on my phone, too restless to play more. I started feeling drowsy, so I grabbed a blanket and lay down on the couch instead of going upstairs, where the storm sounded even louder. After a while, I finally drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, still in the middle of the night, I woke up as a powerful gust shook the house. Pulling the blanket aside, I moved my feet to the floor, planning to check if the furniture outside was still in place. But the moment my feet touched the floor, I felt something wet. Instantly alert, I looked down and saw a puddle near the couch, and another, forming a trail across the floor. Inside the puddles were faint, muddy footprints. My heart pounded as I backed up into a corner, straining to listen for any noise over the wind. Eventually, I followed the footprints through the house, upstairs and downstairs. They clearly led from the back door, which I'd forgotten to lock when I came in from the rain. I quickly locked it and pulled out my phone to call 911. Then, a chilling thought struck me. What if whoever it was still here? I quietly moved into the most hidden corner I could find and made the call. When the police arrived, they looked around, finding the same footprints but nothing else out of place. They said it seemed like a targeted visit since nothing was stolen, and it seemed like the intruder was focused specifically on this house. Strangely enough, it seemed they had come right up to where I was sleeping but did nothing except watch me. Creepy as it was, it didn't make much sense. If they'd intended to harm me, they had the chance to do so right then. After thinking it over, I began to wonder if this intruder was actually after my roommate. Maybe they saw me, searched the house, and then left when they realized I was alone. If this was truly intended for my roommate, I hate to imagine how it might have gone if they had been here. Last year, I was staying at my friend's place to look after their pets, a few lizards and fish, and keep their houseplants watered. They were on a 2-week work trip, and I had agreed to help out. Their house was way nicer than my small apartment, so I was happy to do it. The first week went by smoothly, and it almost felt like a mini vacation. But one evening, while I was sitting at the kitchen table, I suddenly heard someone cough right outside. Startled me as it was really close, almost right outside the back door. I quickly turned on the outdoor lights, hoping whoever it was would see someone was home. After a minute, I glanced outside, but they were gone. The whole thing left me uneasy. A bit later, feeling hungry, I decided to step out for some food. As I walked out, I noticed faint footprints on the lawn, pressed down grass forming a path. The footprints led from the sidewalk to the back of the house, then turned back toward the street. I went to get food but couldn't stop thinking about it. Who would be wandering around there like that? When I returned, I checked the yard again but didn't see any new footprints. Inside, I relaxed with the TV for a while and eventually started to get sleepy. As I was about to head to bed, I heard faint footsteps outside again. Someone was moving through the front yard, heading toward the front door, then circling around to the back. I sat up, now fully alert, as I heard the back door handle rattling. Someone was trying to get in. I went to the top of the stairs and flicked on the downstairs lights. The noise stopped. I crept down a few steps, peering over the railing toward the back door. No one was there anymore, but then, out of nowhere, glass shattered. I couldn't see where from my spot, but the crash was loud. I bolted upstairs and hid in the bedroom. Footsteps crunched on the broken glass as they entered. They began thrashing around downstairs, breaking things and knocking over furniture. I called the police, hoping they'd arrive quickly. The intruder eventually stomped up the stairs, going into one of the spare rooms and trashing it too. Then they came toward the room I was in. The door was locked, but they tried to force it open, slamming something against it until a panel cracked, letting them reach in and unlock it. A man burst in, his face hidden under a mask and a hood, wielding a metal bat. I was frozen in the corner, watching as he looked around in anger. But he ignored me completely, going straight to smashing the walls, furniture, everything in sight. He tore through the room quickly, then stormed out to the next one, finally going downstairs and leaving through the back. I stood there, shocked and motionless, until the police arrived. My friend cut their trip short and came back the next day. The house was wrecked, furniture overturned, belongings smashed, yet nothing was taken. The police believed it was likely someone with a grudge against my friend, though she couldn't think of anyone who might do this. Since the man had been covered up, I couldn't help much with a description. The scariest part was how he acted, completely indifferent to me, as if I weren't even there. To this day, the reason behind it all remains a mystery. Last year, I had a job at a gas station, a pretty typical setup for odd stories, but you never expect things to happen to you. This particular night, it was raining, not heavily but enough to be unpleasant outside. In weather like this, fewer people come in to pay for gas or buy snacks, so my main task was just to stay alert. Now and then, I'd stroll around the store to stay awake, though I spent most of my time on my phone. While I was scrolling through social media, a strange tapping noise caught my attention. I looked up to see a man standing outside, partially hidden by the hood of his jacket. I gestured for him to come in, showing him the door wasn't locked. Yet he just kept tapping, not seeming to notice me. I went over, opened the door, and greeted him. Without a word or a glance in my direction, he walked straight to the counter. Amused by how unaware he seemed, I went behind the counter as he asked for a pack of cigarettes. He paid in cash, then walked out. That's when I noticed there weren't any cars outside by the pumps or in the lot. The guy just continued down the road, walking in the rain like it was no big deal. I would have thought it less strange if he'd gotten a gas can, maybe for a car that broke down nearby. But he only bought cigarettes. With nothing better to think about, I mulled it over as the hour went on. Eventually, I went back to stocking shelves. Then I heard that same tapping sound. Rounding the aisle, I saw the same man standing outside again. I opened the door, asking if he was okay. He didn't respond. Trying to be helpful, I offered, "You can use the phone if you need to." He muttered something about down the road. I leaned out to look, but didn't see anything. Just an empty gas can by one of the pumps. I pointed to it, asking if he needed help, realizing he might not speak much English. He nodded, so I took his card and filled up the can for him. As I pumped, he stood close behind me, making me uneasy. Once it was full, I quickly handed it back and started to head inside. But then he grabbed my arm, speaking rapidly in a language I didn't understand. I pulled away, and as I neared the door, he shouted something, almost like he was calling to someone. I looked up to see another guy inside the store, hurriedly stuffing things into a backpack. He saw me, then jumped over the counter. After that, everything went black. I came to, lying on the floor with a pounding headache. It seemed only minutes had passed, and I realized the man outside must have hit me to help his friend escape. The police came and took me to the hospital, where I was treated for a concussion and a few stitches but no serious injuries. The worst part? I felt embarrassed, like I'd been tricked so easily. But looking back, I was lucky. The CCTV showed that the guy inside had a gun. If I tried to stop them, it could have ended much worse.